All right, everybody, let's jump into it. Today, we're going to be tackling On Tyranny by Timothy Snyder.
Oh, yeah.
Now, I know what you might be thinking, like another history book,
Right.
but honestly, this one's different. If you're even a little bit worried about the direction things are heading these days,
Yeah.
or if you just want to understand how democracies can kind of fall apart and what you can do to protect yours, this deep dive is for you.
Yeah, you're right to highlight that sense of urgency. Like,
Right.
what can we actually do? And to answer your question up front, yes, Tyranny is worth your time, but
Okay.
it's not just a feel-good read. It's a call to action, and we're going to unpack what that means.
I am intrigued, I've got to say, but before we get into the nitty-gritty,
Sure.
for those who haven't picked it up yet, who is Timothy Snyder? And, why should we care what he has to say about tyranny?
So Snyder's a historian. He specializes in 20th century Europe, particularly the horrors of Nazism and Soviet communism.
Okay.
And that's key because he's not just theorizing about tyranny from some ivory tower.
Right.
Drawing on real lived experiences of how societies, descended into darkness.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I have to admit, sometimes those historical parallels feel a bit distant.
Yeah,
How much does the rise of Nazi Germany really apply to my life today?
that's a fair point, and it's one I hear a lot, but Snyder's brilliance is he distills those complex historical events
What?
into timeless lessons about human behavior.
Right.
So he argues that the patterns of tyranny, the tactics that are used to manipulate people
Yeah.
and seize power, are sadly universal.
Okay, so you're saying it's not just about specific events, but the underlying human psychology.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so relevant. He uses these vivid examples.
Yeah.
Like there's this chilling account of how ordinary Austrians participated in the persecution of Jews after the Nazi annexation.
Wow.
And, they weren't all diehard Nazis, but many saw it as an opportunity, like a way to get ahead or just fit in.
Right?
And it's that chilling willingness to conform, to turn a blind eye to injustice, that's the human flaw that transcends time and place.
That's a really disturbing example. It really makes you wonder how you would react in that kind of situation.
Exactly, and that's what On Tyranny forces you to confront those uncomfortable truths about ourselves and about how easily we can be manipulated or seduced by power.
So it's not just about learning history, it's about understanding ourselves.
Precisely, it's about recognizing those warning signs, the subtle erosion of norms and values that pave the way for tyranny, and that's where his 20 lessons come in.
Okay.
They're like a toolkit for recognizing and resisting authoritarianism no matter where it pops up.
So let's get into those lessons. But I'm also curious about the writing itself. How accessible is this book for, the average reader?
One of the things that makes On Tyranny so impactful is that it is accessible. It's a small book, physically and in scope.
Okay.
Each lesson is presented in this concise, almost like aphoristic style. He doesn't get bogged down in academic jargon.
So it's a quick read, which is always a plus, but is it just a bunch of platitudes?
Right.
Or does he really dig into the how of resisting tyranny?
He gets into the how, and that's where comparing it to other books in this genre is helpful.
Okay.
You have a book like the Dictator book, which is more about the mechanics of power from the leader's perspective.
Mhm.
Then you have How Democracies Die, which focuses on the institutional erosion of democracy, often through seemingly legal means.
So where does On Tyranny fit in?
Snyder kind of bridges that gap between individual action and the institutional safeguards.
Okay.
He combines the historical analysis with practical advice.
Right.
And he's urging readers to be active participants in their own democracy. He even goes so far as to say, get outside,
Yeah.
urging people to engage in real-world action, not just online activism.
Corporeal politics, he calls it, right? But isn't that a bit old-fashioned?
Yeah.
I mean, social media could be a really powerful tool for organizing and raising awareness.
Absolutely. And Snyder acknowledges the power of technology, but he also warns against its pitfalls.
Okay.
He's concerned about echo chambers
Right.
and the illusion of activism that social media can create.
So he's saying online engagement isn't enough.
He's saying that real change requires that corporeal politics, that being physically present,
Yeah.
engaging in your community, making those person-to-person connections that can't be replicated online.
Right.
It's about taking risks, being uncomfortable showing up, even when it's hard.
That's a powerful message, but it also sounds kind of daunting.
It can be, but Snyder doesn't leave you feeling helpless.
Okay.
He gives you concrete actions, things like attending protests, engaging in local politics,
Right.
supporting independent media, even just being mindful of the language we use.
Okay, so this is starting to sound less like a history lesson and more like a manual for survival.
That's a great way to put it.
Right.
It's a guidebook for navigating these turbulent times.
Yeah.
And a reminder that we're not just passive passengers on this ship. We have the power to steer it.
I like that a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, so,
And that's what I find so compelling about his approach. He doesn't just tell us what to fear,
right.
but he gives us these tools to fight back.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most powerful lessons is this idea of believing in truth.
Okay, but what does that even mean today?
Right.
I mean, we're bombarded with misinformation propaganda. Everybody's shouting their own version of the truth.
Yeah.
So how do we even know what to believe anymore?
Well, and Snyder says that's exactly why we need to double down on truth.
Okay.
He has this warning. He says post-truth is pre-fascism.
Wow.
Meaning that when we abandon objective reality, we become incredibly vulnerable to manipulation.
Right.
Tyrants thrive in chaos. They want us questioning everything.
So how do we fight back? Do we all just become like fact-checking fanatics?
It's more than just fact-checking, although that's important.
Okay.
It's about really cultivating critical thinking skills, learning to evaluate sources, and being wary of those who benefit from sowing distrust.
So like questioning the motive behind the information.
Exactly.
Okay.
And Snyder encourages us to read widely, to expose ourselves to different perspectives, even ones that we might disagree with.
Mm-hmm.
He argues that a healthy democracy needs informed citizens who can engage in these thoughtful debates.
He also talks about the importance of institutions, right?
He does.
But to be honest, sometimes it feels like those institutions have failed us.
Yeah.
You look at the financial crisis, political corruption, it goes on and on.
Yeah.
So why should we defend systems that seem rigged against us?
That's a valid question, and Snyder acknowledges that institutions can fail us.
Right.
But he argues the answer isn't to abandon them altogether. He uses this analogy of a house.
Okay.
If the roof is leaking, you don't burn the whole house down.
Right.
You fix the roof.
We need to reform, not destroy.
Exactly. He urges us to support institutions like the courts, the press, even unions.
Yeah.
Because they act as these checks and balances against those in power.
Right.
They provide a framework for accountability and for justice.
Okay.
And without them, individual rights are just much easier to erode.
He even talks about this thing called the Milgram experiment, right?
Yes, the Milgram experiment.
What is that all about?
This is where it gets really fascinating.
Okay.
The Milgram experiment was a psychological study that demonstrated how chillingly willing we are to obey authority,
Really?
even when it means harming other people.
Oh, wow.
So participants were told to administer electric shocks to another person.
Okay.
Now, this person was actually an actor pretending to be in pain,
Gotcha.
but a surprising number of those participants obeyed even when they felt really uncomfortable doing so.
That's disturbing, but what does that have to do with tyranny?
Well, Snyder uses this experiment to illustrate how easily we can succumb to pressure from authority figures,
Right.
even when it goes against our own moral compass.
Yeah.
And he says understanding this tendency, this human tendency, is crucial for resisting tyranny. Because it often starts with these small acts of obedience that then gradually escalate.
It's a slippery slope.
Exactly. We think, oh, it's just one small compromise.
Right.
But those compromises, they add up.
Yeah.
Until we're complicit in something horrific.
And that's why he says don't obey in advance.
Exactly.
Right.
Because anticipating a tyrant's wishes only empowers them.
This is making me think about my own life and times when I've stayed silent or gone along with something
Right.
when I knew it was wrong.
That's precisely the point Snyder wants us to examine our own behavior.
Yeah.
Become more aware of these subtle ways we might be contributing to the problem.
Right.
And then most importantly, he says take action to change it.
Okay, so we've talked about the truth institutions, individual responsibility.
Oh.
But what about those who are already in power? The ones actively trying to erode democracy?
Right.
How do we deal with them?
That's where his lesson beware the one-party state comes in.
Okay.
And he argues that power concentrated in the hands of just one party, regardless of their ideology.
Right.
That's a recipe for disaster.
Okay.
He emphasizes how important it is to have a multi-party system
Right.
where different viewpoints can be debated and challenged.
But isn't that kind of idealistic?
Yeah,
I mean, in our current political climate, everything feels so polarized.
it can feel that way, but Snyder says we can't just give in to cynicism.
Okay.
He says, remember professional ethics, meaning we should hold our leaders accountable to a higher standard,
Yeah.
regardless of what party they belong to.
Mhm.
We should demand integrity, transparency, a commitment to the common good.
So don't just blindly follow your party. Think for yourself.
Exactly. He urges us to be skeptical of easy answers, to question the motives of those in power,
Right.
and to be wary of anyone who claims to have a monopoly on truth.
Wow, this is a lot to digest. I'm starting to see why you said this book is a call to action.
It is, and while it can feel overwhelming at times,
Yeah.
Snyder also offers hope.
Okay.
He reminds us that history isn't predetermined.
Right.
Individuals can make a difference, and that's where those practical lessons, those 20 concrete actions come in.
This has been a really insightful conversation. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground,
Yeah,
but there's still so much to unpack.
absolutely. And I think for those who are really grappling with these ideas, comparing On Tyranny
Yeah.
to other books like The Dictator's Handbook or How Democracies Die
Right.
can offer even more nuance and depth.
Yeah. And for our listeners, we'll be right back to wrap up our deep dive into On Tyranny
Yes.
with our final verdict and some thoughts to ponder.
Yeah.
Don't go anywhere. All right. We are back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into On Tyranny. And, you know, as we've been talking, I keep coming back to that phrase, corporeal politics.
Yeah.
It's such a striking phrase, and it really gets to the heart of Snyder's message about, like, taking action.
It really does, and I think it's worth kind of unpacking that a little bit more.
Yeah.
Snyder argues that tyrants want us isolated, passive, glued to our screens.
Right.
They thrive when we retreat into that digital world and disengage from our physical communities.
So he's saying we need to, like, get out of our comfort zones, literally.
Exactly. He urges us to engage in what he calls corporeal politics.
Right.
Which means, being physically present, showing up in real life. It's about attending town hall meetings, joining protests,
Mm-hmm.
volunteering for causes that we believe, and even just having those face-to-face conversations with
Right.
people who have different points of view.
It's about making those human connections that are so easy to lose in the digital world.
Precisely. And it's not always easy or comfortable.
Right.
But Snyder reminds us that real courage often involves risk, discomfort,
Yeah.
and sometimes even facing danger.
And he uses some pretty vivid examples from history to illustrate this point, right?
He does like that story of the White Rose resistance group in Nazi Germany.
Yes, exactly.
The White Rose was this group of students who dared to speak out against Hitler's regime.
Right.
They were distributing leaflets calling for peaceful resistance, and they knew the risks.
Yeah.
And ultimately, they paid the ultimate price for their bravery.
That's a really sobering reminder that standing up for what's right can have consequences.
Absolutely. And Snyder doesn't sugarcoat those challenges, but he also emphasizes that those small acts of courage,
Right.
even if they seem insignificant, in the grand scheme of things, can have this ripple effect. They can inspire others. They can chip away at the facade of tyranny
Yeah.
and create those cracks in the wall of oppression.
He also talks about the importance of, like, giving to good causes.
He does.
And not just in times of crisis, but as a regular practice.
Yes. And this doesn't have to mean grand gestures.
Right.
It could be as simple as volunteering at a local soup kitchen, donating to a charity that you believe in,
Yeah.
or just simply standing up for someone who's being bullied or marginalized. It's about making that conscious choice to contribute to the well-being of your community,
Right.
to make the world a slightly better place through your actions.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that we're all interconnected and that our individual choices have an impact.
Exactly. And that's what ultimately makes On Tyranny such a powerful and timely read.
Right.
It's a reminder that we're not powerless in the face of authoritarianism.
Okay.
We have agency, we have a voice, and we have that responsibility to use them.
So if someone's listening to this and thinking, okay, I'm convinced I need to read this book,
Right.
what's like the one key takeaway you want them to walk away with?
I think the most important thing to remember is that tyranny doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
It's this gradual process, this slow erosion of norms, values, and institutions.
Yeah.
And that means that we have to be vigilant. We have to pay attention to the warning signs.
Right.
And we have to be willing to act before it's too late.
So On Tyranny is not just a history lesson, it's a wake-up call.
Absolutely. And it's a call to action.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that the future of democracy doesn't rest on the shoulders of politicians or institutions alone.
Yeah.
But on each and every one of us.
And on that note, I think we have reached the end of our deep dive.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation and for helping us unpack this really important book.
It's been my pleasure.
And for those of you listening out there, we encourage you to pick up a copy of On Tyranny and decide for yourself.
Yeah,
It's a book that will challenge you, it will inspire you, and hopefully it will empower you to make a difference.
absolutely.
Thanks for joining us. And remember, the fight for democracy is an ongoing one.
It is.
Let's stay informed, stay engaged, and stay vigilant.